I think the 90s era of comic books, I mean, that's when I got into it. I don't know. I mean, I think we're all of different age groups here, but it's definitely it was a provocative time in comics. I mean, a lot of shit happened, right? A lot of different art styles. The creators, I think, I mean, you have the speculation market, all that kind of stuff created just a whirlwind of, you know, good stuff, and then also, there's just a lot of highs and lows in the industry. So, how did if we'll go down the line? How did it influence you guys artistically?
Well, personally, when I was growing up, I was reading. I wasn't so much into the mainstream. But I was reading more European comics because I'm born in Algeria, raised in the States, but I had that influence, and so it was all the BDs from Belgium, from France, and everything. So essentially, I was reading comics from the 50s in the 90s. Which makes me about 90 years old now. But so I was reading Lucky Luke, Asterix, and Obelix. But obviously, I did dive into some of the comics. Spider-Man was big, obviously. It was like Todd McFarlane and John Romita Jr. Those were my guys. And then also Dragon Ball Z, which rest in peace.
Yeah, dude.
Era. That's a big loss. Yeah. But Dragon Ball Z was my thing, and the cartoons. I mean, that's what I was doing in the 90s: eating cereal and watching cartoons.
Fuck yeah.
I also had some cereal, and it was my fondest memories. No, so in the 90s, I'm a kid of the 90s, so I grew up in all that stuff. I ate it all up, and I think, for better or for worse, I think every kid, you are starving for things that will fuel your imagination. And maybe you're only getting junk food, but to you, it's a feast. So I would read McFarlane's Spider-Man. I would read Eric Larson's Spider-Man as well. But I read anything, and even if there's just like a kernel of an idea, it felt amazing to me. I remember I used to pore over the Zelda manual, just the art in that and the storytelling in that, which is minimal, but to me, I was like, that was my Lord of the Rings. I was like, oh my God, there's so much going on here. So it's funny. I have nothing but fond memories of the 90s, and I know I read maybe some better comics later on that were from earlier and from later, but there's something about the 90s that it hits a certain itch. Also, I will say real quick too, I think the 90s set up a whole generation of cartoonists have unreasonable expectations of financial windfall. Yeah. Reading Wizard magazine, I was like, Mom, shut the fuck up. I'm not going to school anymore. I'm going to get a jet. I'm going to do this and that. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. Look at Rob Liefeld. I can draw as good as him. It's going to be fine, Mom.
I'll be able to.
Yeah.
You do what Kevin Eastman did, buy a fucking tank.
Right. Oh my God. We'll get there.
You guys don't have tanks.
We don't have bootleg Spider-Man money. It's true.
Neither do I. Wesley?
For me, I think it was I was lucky to have an older brother that was very interested in corrupting me as much as he was corrupted by the comics that he had. So it was a lot of Dark Horse stuff. We were big Star Wars and fans of the Alien franchise, and he had those. But the one in particular that was really like fueling my imagination and being very provocative to me at the time was he had Hard Boiled, the Jeff Darrow, Frank Miller comic, which he would have been 9, I would have been 7 looking at that filthy fucking book, and it was really quite something. And then from there, in the mid to, I guess, all throughout the 90s, really, we were seeing the early days of manga getting translated really in a big, bad way by Viz, and I remember that was very interesting to me, just because I didn't really see a lot of comics that were let alone drawn in the style of manga, but just being black and white was very enticing to me, and I gravitated towards that as I was fueling my my comics love.
There's a great sex scene in the Hard Boiled, especially for an under 10-year-old kid.
No, it was so wild to see, and I remember that feeling of we're gonna get in so much trouble if our mom finds out, gets wise to us seeing that stuff. But luckily she still doesn't know to this day, so we're all good.
one thing I noticed that you all did while you were talking about what got you into the 90s is you weren't just dropping the titles, but the names of artists and creators. And when I think back, and you tell me if you agree and if this was a thing for you, it was the first time where I started paying attention to who was creating the books and like who was doing what, you know, who was the writer, who was the artist. I mean, yeah, Wizard Magazine, as much as we all can hate on it for many reasons, I think initially had a lot to do, at least with me, like, okay, so I like these comics, I've been reading them and picking them off the newsstand for years, but now I'm starting to understand that these things are actually created and how they're created. And at least for me, that made me fall in love with the medium anymore. But like, would you guys agree? Did you guys have a similar experience, or?
I mean, personally, I wouldn't say I'm a fraud, but all that stuff happened to me retroactively. So when
Not a fraud, is when you discovered it, man.
You're a fraud.
I'm saying I'm a fraud.
Faker.
Yeah, they're gonna get me anytime soon. So all that for me was retroactive. When I was reading comics, I mean, I didn't pay attention to any of that. Like, I didn't even realize. I would go through the credits so quick. I would just dive straight into the story, and I think that's kind of what I still like about comics and how I approach my own comics. That it's all story based. Okay. In my mind, the point of the book is to turn the page, and unless that's happening, then I don't think I'm doing my job as a creator. But I never really paid attention to the artist names until I realized I liked a certain style and I would gravitate to that, and then it ended up being the same artist every time. So then, I got that.
Yeah, I think I'm with you, Manny. Like, in the late 80s and 90s, I'm becoming, 9 and 10, 11 years old, and that's when I'm starting to notice, I like this issue of Spider-Man better than the other issue. Yeah. And it's like, that's because this guy drew it. And it was primarily the artist. And then, Frank Miller is obviously a huge icon of the 80s, but to me, it was the 90s when I kind of got into his stuff. Yeah, and same. Yeah, and like I did a 4-page comic about it, but Batman 89 is sort of like is basically my origin story. That movie you can't escape the movie, and then all the comics were being pushed in bookstores. I got Dark Knight Returns, and so that to me was like, it's 89, so 90s the next year. Yeah, that's part of it. But yeah, all those. It's funny. I think that's what I was kind of saying before. Even if people don't like a certain decade, if you are a certain age, that is your formative years, for better or for worse. So I can't escape that. When Image Comics happened, I was primed for it. I liked half those guys from all their Marvel work, and I was like, this is like a new universe. I could get it on the ground floor. Yeah. I'm sure it'll be written really well. And it was perfect timing. I'm really happy that I just kind of all worked out for me as a reader. I remember in the 90s, in my apartment complex, there's this older guy named Nick who was like 23, and he read more comics than me. And so I would just ask him, like, so Fantastic Four, so Reed Richards and Dr. Doom went to college together? He's like, that's right, Tony. We'd be playing basketball. And I'd ask him a million questions. And then when the Image books came out, I was like, you can ask me anything you want about, Cyberforce. It's like, okay, well, I'm good. Thanks for the offer. And that was kind of, I felt like, yeah, Cyberforce is mine.
Tell you about Shaft. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there was like a thrill for me of like being young and like connecting dots and seeing something. Yeah, exactly. Like Frank Miller, for instance. I didn't know. Like I always like thought of Hard Boiled as like, that's the book that looks like that. It looks like Jeff Darrow. It's not really a Frank Miller book in my head, because he doesn't really write very much. It's kind of him taking a backseat to be like, hey, world, enjoy the Jeff Darrow show. But then when I was a kid, I remember I had like, it's weird how I came about to Sin City. I'm a big Sin City fan, but I came about it because I had that Marv action figure first, and I was like, this is the coolest fucking thing ever. What is this book that it belongs to? And then I read the book and fell in love with it. And from there, it just kind of like, as much as we rag on Wizard, it was like I didn't have Google yet, so it was like nice to have something to be like, well, here are these like people that you can check out, and like for whatever like Wizard failed at, it was a great success for like providing young people sort of like it
opened some kind of door or window, I think.
Absolutely.
And then we went through it and maybe walked our own path, but like I think the media coverage had a lot to do with it, because it at least for me, it made me aware of how the books were created and who created them, and that made me like start to see comics a little differently, you know, like, okay, so maybe this is something I can do one day. And me and my friends started making our own comics, you know, like, because it's like we figured out like, all right, so this is how these things are made.
Yeah, I mean, like Wizard magazine, like there is a lot of bad that it did, but like there's a lot of good it did for me personally. Like I didn't know every comic. There wasn't always a bunch of comic book stores like there is now, right? So like discovering creators like Palmer's Picks, right? Like it's huge. Like that's a huge part of Wizard that like turned me on to stuff. And then like I think too, like I'm hearing what you guys are saying. It's funny to think about like how much comics have changed from the 90s, because the 90s was more art driven. Yeah. Right? Like then once the Image guys left, that's when the publishers were like, we can't be putting so much stock in artists. At least that's what, as an outsider, that's kind of what I took from it.
I was gonna say, like, if you would have told me when I was 15, like, so the thing is, it's gonna be the writers driving stuff, and also the Avengers will be more popular than the X-Men. I was like, that can't happen. There's no way. Like, to me, I was like, Avengers is the dorkiest thing in the world. X-Men, it's all about art, and also if you would have told me, and people make comics and not be millionaires, like, no, we make millions now, so we'll make even more in the future.
I mean, they made, look, Silvestri became a millionaire. All of these creators became millionaires because of royalties too, right? Like they were treating creators a little bit better back then than they are now. But it is funny also because, like Wesley, you mentioned like manga becoming big, right? Like I feel like some of those artists being influenced by them kind of made the American market more ready for that kind of stuff. I don't know if you guys agree in that sense.
Well, I mean, my introduction to manga was through the animes. So when I would tune in and watch DBZ, and I would spend hours, and my brain would melt and everything, and then I discovered it was a comic book. I was like, oh my God, and then you read it backwards, and it was like, oh my God, it was just so much, input. I mean, that was my gateway to manga, for sure. Yeah. And then you discovered that it's a whole country making millions of books, and it's just this plethora of art and beautiful stuff. But I don't know, for me it was, DBZ, Broly, The Legend of fucking Frieza. My brother, he came home one day with a VHS tape of bootleg VHS tape of DBZ, all in Japanese, and we watched it every day. And I didn't understand a word, but I felt every single one. Like it was insane. Yeah. I forgot the question. DBZ.
I mean, you just said that like you hadn't been to a comic shop, and I think another big thing for me was also like comics were in a lot more places in the 90s than they are now. So you could go to 7-Eleven, you could go to like a drugstore, you could go to the mall, Walden Books, they had a rack, like
the market.
Yeah, dude. I mean, there was a small like cafeteria, little like cafe near my house, like a Cuban cafe. They sold comic books and Marvel trading cards, the stuff was literally everywhere, and it was distributed in such a different way that like you just saw it everywhere, and it just seemed like you could find it without having really to look for it. And I think that had a lot to do with like our generation being able to get the accessibility was easier. Of course, once the comic stores came, that opened like the door to even older comics and different kind of comics. But I mean, when Image was big, I mean, I think they were selling those things everywhere, like
they were everywhere.
Yeah, and I don't know if like for you guys, like what's the weirdest place you ever found comics at? Like for me, it was that cafe. Like literally, I'd go get like a Cuban sandwich, and like they had a short box of like new books, like sitting next to the coffee,
So I grew up in Arizona, and we have washes, this is basically a canal for water to get out and stuff like that. So one time we walking around the wash, and we saw a bunch of porno mags, and I was like, we should investigate this further. Yeah. And then there's also a copy Brigade and some other Image book, and I was like,
Brigade and porno.
So here's the deal.
I mean, sounds like a good afternoon.
Yeah, I was like, I think we should just, I'll get all the books, and when I'm done, you guys can share them. But I was like, because in a weird way, a lot of those Image books were illicit to me. Like I remember when I was a little kid, I was actually really weirdly religious for like 2 years, and I saw Spawn issue 4, and the cover was like the Violator's face, and I was like, that is satanic. I think that's probably a really evil. But I was like, well, Tom McMillen did Spider-Man. I was like, I think I should buy it, and I was like, I'm gonna go to hell. And I was like, it looks so cool. I was like, maybe I should go to hell. And so I got it. I definitely got it. And like, it's funny. I was religious, but my mom wasn't. She wasn't like. I guess she was doing this for. She's like, enjoy Spawn. But I was like, no, I can't. And so I hide it from her, and it was really ridiculous. But I think it worked out.
I think we're uncovering something here.
This intervention.
Those 2 years of your life.
Was that an answer to the question?
You mentioned cool too, and I think comics kind of became cool in that period too, because I also remember like in middle school, people that normally didn't even read comics, when Spawn came out, like all the metalheads were into it.
Yeah.
Like the first time I got a look at Spawn #1, you know, it had sold out. I couldn't get a copy. It was like the metal kid in my math class had a copy.
Right.
And he had no other comics except for that one, you know?
Yeah.
And then he started getting into them too. So I think they had an appeal to people outside of comics. And I mean, that might have been the media saturation as well. But I don't know. I think, like you said, the concepts were, like, for lack of a better word, were just cooler. As much as it might not seem that way in hindsight, at the time, I think that they were, and they appealed to like more people.
I was curious about something. I know like Calvin and Hobbes is a strip that starts in the 80s, but I feel like in the 90s, those collections were like really ubiquitous for like,
They were everywhere.
Yeah, that was like the last time I remember like seeing a lot of like kids I knew they weren't into comics, but like Calvin and Hobbes was like everybody, like I don't know anybody that's like I fucking hate Calvin and Hobbes. Like
You get them from like Scholastic.
Yeah, the Weekly Reader and the school book fairs. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
And those collections were also in a lot of bookstores. And also at that time is when you started to see like the collections creeping up at like Walden Books. Like there'd be like a little shelf next to like the Dungeons and Dragons books with like, you know, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. And those things started being collected at that time too. And that's different from the stuff we've been talking about, you know? Because I remember specifically being on vacation with my family, going to Walden Books in Naples, Florida, and buying The Killing Joke and the second volume of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing and reading them and not understanding what the fuck was going on. I was clearly way too young, you know?
how old were you?
12?
Oh, okay.
You know, so
I was 9 when I read those for the first time. I definitely didn't understand what
yeah, like I was confused with Killing Joke, like because of the flashback structure. I didn't get it. I was like, wait, is there two Batmen? Like, why, you know, why does it seem they know who he is in one scene and they don't know who he is in the other? And like,
Something I wanted to ask real quick. We're talking a lot about like how we felt when we were kids. Now, when you go back and read these comic books, like, do you still have that same sense of joy? Like for me, like it depends. Like some of it doesn't hold up, but like I can still put myself back in that headspace and enjoy it like I did. But how do you guys feel when you go back and look at that stuff?
Your position's kind of unique because a lot of stuff you didn't even check out before, right?
Well, I mean, I just learned how to read. So.
Right. We're all proud.
So, I don't know. I mean, yeah. So before making comics, I was doing music, and so from 14 to now, basically a couple years ago, I was into guitars and rock and roll, and just I stopped watching ABC. It's pretty sad.
Cool.
I was trying to be cool.
Yeah, you were cool.
Yeah, it didn't work out, but I was trying, and so only after COVID, where all the gigs kind of went away, did I start diving into comics. And so the last 2 years that I've been making comics, I've been, I don't know, like Matrix downloading comics into my brain. And so I'm rediscovering and rereading. Like I reread all the McFarlane Spider-Mans and I fucking love them.
yeah.
Like for me, they are pure poetry. It's just insanity on paper and it's great. It's like a leg is here while he's saying time to pay. And it's just like a weird, crazy thing. And then I started paying attention to the creators, the editors, and all these things. And you have these kind of weird moments where the editor on Spider-Man McFarlane was Jim Salicrup.
Yep.
And then recently I was at a Comic-Con, Big Apple Con in New York, where across from me was Jim Salicrup. And he looked at me, he picked up my Bootleg Spider-Man, and so I had a full 360 where the editor of the Spider-Man I was reading bought my Spider-Man comic, and then recently we went and hung out and just like perused comics downtown, and I'm just having these weird kind of, flashes of my childhood and my adulthood kind of coming together. So yeah, I mean, put myself in a mindset of a 12-year-old, easy. Yeah, like it happens all the time.
I'm just picturing you like Matrix downloading comics into your head, and you wake up and you're like, I know Jim Aparo.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's hard to divorce myself from my old feelings when I read those books. Like I can, if I'm more objective, I can see some faults, obviously. But like Jim Aparo, I have this issue of Legends of the Dark Knight, which he does some of the art in, and Mike McMillen did the cover, and the stories. There's Keith Gibbons in there. There's everyone in the world, and it's one of my favorite books. And I to me, it's like this crazy psychedelic thing. Like, you know, I can remember being like 9, going like, oh, I'm like expanding my consciousness, and you know, I understand that it's just a little comic book from the 90s, but I still have that feeling. I think there's also some secret gems. I think there's actually some mainstream and definitely some indie comics from the 90s which are great. And it's one of those things where it's like, you know, you see like Tarantino will talk about, he's like, you know, as a guy who liked movies, the 80s was like a desert. There was no good movies in the 80s. And it's like, that's not true. There was the rise of the blockbuster movie, and yes, there's like Back to the Future and all that stuff, but there's plenty of good stuff. And in fact, most times when there's something in the mainstream no one likes, there's something, you know, on the underground that's actually burgeoning and becoming really awesome, like punk rock and stuff like that. There's always that. So the 90s had all that for me, and I do wonder though, like, if this period of comics, what it will be remembered as. It's harder to have like a, you know, monoculture now, which is probably good, but I don't know if like in 10 years people are like, oh man, he's still drawing like it's 2024. It's kind of sad. Like, I don't know.
I mean, I think maybe this is the era of the indie comics.
Yeah,
I would agree with that.
Considering where we are.
I would say that like the pandemic having like a lot of creative types like ourselves to be like stuck at home for like prolonged periods of time, like I don't know, it's like I was trying to call it like the new American craft movement or something like that in my head, but I don't know if that's too silly.
I like, you actually made me think of The Year Without a Summer, you know, Mary Shelley and all those. It basically, it rained like a long time, so all these great works of literature happened basically because of that, and drugs and orgies. But I was like, yeah, that's our period now. We're there.
Minus the drugs and orgies.
Speak for yourself.
I don't know, like all the stuff I read when I was a kid, it's hard for me to take off those like rose-colored glasses. I still think like I don't know, like all those Frank Miller stuff like that I read like when I was young, I still think is absolutely great, if not better than when I read them when I was 14. I have tried to go back and like I remember a couple of years ago I was reading all the Fourth World Jack Kirby stuff and Fantastic Four at the same time. Oh wow. Going back and forth, and I was like, I think I like the Jack Kirby stuff without Stan Lee way more, just because I have to read far less. And yeah, I don't know. Right now I'm actually like going through like Tomb of Dracula. I've never read it before, and that's been a lot of fun.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's safe to say that the 90s, you know, like I love the 90s comics. I think it's a great era, and I think that, like Tony, you said, like while there can be low points, there's a lot of great stuff that came out. Yeah, and yeah.
I mean, to go back on what Tony was talking about of the this era of comics, so now we have creators that are from the 90s making comics today, and I think that is something that is I think so. The comics industry, I'm new to it, but as far as art goes, I think it's one of the most welcoming communities, one of the most welcoming industries, and it's a proof that you can follow something, do something, work extremely hard at it, and something can come from it. And I think maybe it's the optimism of the 90s that fuels our blind faith in it, but there's still remnants of that.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's like, I mean, shit on the 90s all you want. Like, everyone up here has said that was like when they really got into comics. So whatever indie comics we are creating now, you can trace a line directly back to being inspired by that. So even if it was even if it was a spark that started a fire, like, worth examining that spark, because you don't have a fire without a spark, you know?
That's it. On that note, shit on the 90s if you want to. We wouldn't be here without them. Let's give these men a round of applause.
Thank you.